The mist creeps through the Ozark valleys like something with intent, something that knows where it's going and what it seeks. In the autumn of 1894, when the leaves fell early and the air carried a smell like copper and earth, there was a homestead deep in the Missouri hills where no birds sang. The Whitlock property sat at the end of a road that locals had stopped maintaining years before, a rutted path that wound through oak and hickory so dense that midday sun barely penetrated. The house itself was built from native stone, quarried from the bluffs that overlooked the property, gray and cold even in summer, with windows that reflected nothing, as if light itself refused to acknowledge what happened behind those walls. Travelers who passed near the property, and there were few foolish enough to do so, reported hearing sounds that had no source. Children laughing where no children played, hammering that came from underground. And at night, a low humming, rhythmic and deliberate, like a heartbeat amplified through the earth itself. The Whitlock family had lived on that land for 3 generations by 1894. They had wealth, though no one knew its source. They had influence, though they never came to town. And they had a secret buried so deep that when it finally surfaced, it would reveal something about human nature that most people spend their lives trying to forget. This is the story of what happens when a family believes they can escape the consequences of their choices by hiding those consequences in the dark. This is the story of what grows in that darkness when you feed it long enough. Welcome to this channel. Today, we step into a case that is not just difficult to understand, it reshapes the meaning of fear itself. Like the video, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The Whitlock family arrived in the Ozark region in 1849, part of the Western migration that followed the promise of cheap land and new beginnings. The patriarch, Cornelius Whitlock, was a man of education and means, unusual for a homesteader. He brought with him his wife Martha, 3 sons, and a wagon filled not with farming equipment but with books, medical instruments and specimens preserved in jars that he would not let anyone examine. He purchased 800 acres of remote territory, land so isolated that his nearest neighbor was 12 miles away through terrain that would break a wagon and kill a horse. Cornelius built his stone house in a valley where 2 streams converged, a place the local Cherokee had abandoned a generation earlier, calling it cursed ground where the earth dreamed bad things. He ignored the warnings. Within 2 years, he had established not a farm but something else, something the few visitors who saw it described as part laboratory, part library, and part something they had no words for. A traveling preacher who stopped at the Whitlock homestead in 1852 kept a journal that survived him. His entry for June 14th describes an unsettling visit. Mr. Whitlock received me with courtesy but no warmth. His home is filled with books on subjects no Christian should study: anatomy, heredity, bloodlines, breeding practices for livestock that he discusses as if applicable to humans. When I asked about his family, he showed me his 3 sons, then ages 12, 10, and 8. The boys were unnaturally quiet, obedient to the point of unnerving, and they watched their father with an intensity that suggested not love but fear, or perhaps worship. Mr. Whitlock spoke at length about his theories of improving the human stock through careful selection, about eliminating weakness from bloodlines, about creating, through deliberate choice, a family that would be superior to common humanity. I attempted to discuss Christian charity and God's plan, but he dismissed me, saying that God's plan was chaos and that man's duty was to impose order on the chaos through will and knowledge. I left deeply disturbed and have prayed nightly since for the souls in that household. The Whitlock sons grew to adulthood in that isolated valley, educated by their father in subjects both conventional and disturbing. Cornelius taught them medicine, biology, philosophy, and his own theories about heredity and genetic improvement, theories that were decades ahead of formal eugenics movements but rooted in the same dark soil. By 1870, all 3 sons had reached marrying age, but Cornelius had not prepared them for integration into normal society. He had prepared them for something else. In the spring of 1870, 3 young women arrived at the Whitlock homestead, sisters from a destitute family in Arkansas who had been offered employment as housekeepers and teachers for the younger generation to come. Their names were Sarah, Elizabeth, and Catherine Moore, ages 19, 17, and 16 respectively. The circumstances of their arrival were documented in a letter from their father, found in 1896 among the Moore family papers. My daughters go to the Whitlock household with my blessing and my desperation. We have nothing. The drought has taken our crops for 3 years running. Mr. Whitlock has offered employment, housing, and a sum of money sufficient to save our farm and feed my remaining children. He assures me the girls will be treated with respect and Christian decency. He assures me they will be cared for. I have no choice but to trust him. May God watch over them where I cannot. The Moore sisters disappeared into the Whitlock Valley and were never seen in public again. Over the next 20 years, the Whitlock family grew in number but remained invisible to the outside world. Occasionally, someone from the settlements would venture near the property and report seeing children, many children, playing in the yards or working the gardens. But these witnesses noted something peculiar. The children all looked remarkably similar, as if they were not just related but copies of a single template, variations in age and gender but with the same features, the same build, the same unsettling way of moving in synchronization. In 1889, a census taker attempted to visit the Whitlock homestead as part of his official duties. His report, filed with the county clerk, describes an encounter that left him shaken. I approached the property on July 23rd with my official papers and authority. I was met at the boundary, which is marked by stone cairns, by 2 men who identified themselves as Whitlock's sons. They were identical in appearance, both approximately 40 years of age, both speaking in the same measured tone, often completing each other's sentences. I requested access to conduct the census as required by law. They refused, stating that the Whitlock family did not recognize external authority over their domestic arrangements. When I insisted, they became not aggressive but somehow more disturbing in their calmness. One of them said, "We are conducting an experiment that cannot be interrupted by outside interference. What we are creating here will justify any temporary deviation from social norms. In 2 more generations, we will have proven what can be accomplished through careful management of bloodlines. You may tell your authorities that the Whitlock household numbers 27 individuals, all in good health, all content with their circumstances." I attempted to proceed regardless, and both men simply stood in my path, unmoving, staring at me with eyes that held no emotion, no anger, just absolute certainty. I retreated. I have marked the Whitlock property as refusing census participation and have recommended that authorities investigate, though I suspect no one will. No investigation occurred. The Whitlock family was wealthy enough to avoid scrutiny, isolated enough to avoid notice, and the local authorities, underfunded and overwhelmed, had neither the resources nor the inclination to force the issue with a family that paid their taxes and caused no overt trouble. But the people who lived in the scattered settlements around the Whitlock Valley, the families who had been there for generations, they knew something was wrong. They knew from the sounds that carried on the wind. They knew from the occasions when Whitlock family members came to trade for supplies, moving as a group, purchasing odd items, chemicals and tools and medical equipment that had no business on a homestead. They knew from the children who sometimes appeared at the edges of the property, staring out at the world beyond with expressions that combined curiosity with something darker, something hungry. In 1890, a young boy from a neighboring farm wandered too close to the Whitlock boundary while hunting. He returned home 3 days later, unable to explain where he had been. Suffering from fever and nightmares that persisted for months, his mother, a widow named Agnes Porter, kept a diary where she recorded her son's disturbed sleep-talking. The entries make for difficult reading. Thomas cries out in his sleep about rooms underground. He speaks of children who are also adults, adults who are also children, all the same age somehow, all watching him. He describes a woman with white hair who touched his face and told him he had good bones, strong blood, that if he wanted, he could stay and join the family, that they were always looking for fresh material to strengthen the line. He says there were people in cages underground, but they weren't prisoners, they were volunteers, waiting their turn to contribute. I don't understand what he saw or if the fever has made him imagine horrors, but he refuses to go near that property again and wakes screaming if I suggest it. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The situation that would finally expose the Whitlock family secret began in the summer of 1894 with a drought that gripped the Ozarks like a fist. Streams dried to trickles, wells ran empty, and the earth cracked open in wounds that revealed layers of clay and stone. On the Whitlock property, one of those cracks opened beneath an outlying structure, a barn set away from the main house. The structure's foundation gave way, and the building collapsed into a void that had opened beneath it. The collapse was seen by a group of surveyors working in the area for the railroad company, which was considering a route through the region. The surveyors, concerned that someone might be injured and bound by law to render aid, approached the Whitlock property despite knowing the family's reputation for hostile isolation. What they found would lead to the unraveling of 3 generations of secrets. The lead surveyor, a man named George Hutchins, filed a report with both the railroad company and local authorities. His account is preserved in the county archives, and his handwriting becomes increasingly erratic as the pages progress. We arrived at the collapsed structure at approximately 2 in the afternoon on August 6th. The building had fallen into what appeared to be a natural cave or sinkhole. We called out to see if anyone required assistance. Hearing no response, I descended into the opening with 2 of my men to ensure no one was trapped. What we discovered was not a natural formation but a constructed space, a network of rooms carved from the limestone bedrock, accessible from the barn but extending under much of the property. The rooms were lit by oil lamps that were still burning, suggesting recent occupancy. And in those rooms, we found evidence of activities that I struggled to describe without my hands shaking. The surveyor's report continues with descriptions that were partially redacted when filed officially but survive in Hutchins's personal papers, donated to a historical society in 1948. The first room contained medical equipment, examination tables, instruments for surgery, and detailed charts covering the walls. The charts documented what I can only describe as breeding records, genealogies tracking 3 generations of the Whitlock family, with notations about physical characteristics, mental capabilities, health conditions, and outcomes of various unions. The unions were marked as successful or failed based on the quality of offspring produced. I saw names repeated in ways that made no biological sense until I understood with growing horror what I was reading. Brothers and sisters, fathers and daughters, mothers and sons, every possible combination, all documented with the cold precision of a stockbreeder's ledger. The notations included comments like subject A7 shows improved jaw structure but recurring tremor, likely culling necessary, and union of B3 with B9 produced twins, both viable, mental acuity above average, retained for next generation. Second room, we found what I initially thought were medical specimens, preserved tissues and organs in jars of formaldehyde. But the labels indicated these were not teaching specimens. They were records, failed experiments. Each jar was marked with a date, a genetic designation, and a brief note explaining why that particular specimen had been terminated. Spinal deformity non-viable, seizure disorder uncontrollable, mental deficiency dangerous. The jars numbered in the dozens. The third room was worse. Hutchins's description is clinical, but the horror bleeds through every word. We found cells, 6 of them, carved into the rock and fitted with iron bars. 5 were empty but showed signs of recent habitation. The 6th contained a woman, approximately 30 years of age, in an advanced state of pregnancy. She did not respond to our presence with fear or hope, but with a blank acceptance that was more disturbing than terror would have been. When we asked her name, she said she was Whitlock. They were all Whitlock. Names didn't matter because they were all part of the same design. When we asked if she was held against her will, she seemed confused by the question. She said she was serving the family purpose, that she had been selected for breeding because of her strong constitution and favorable genetic markers, that the child she carried was her contribution to the perfection of the line. We asked who the father was. She pointed to a chart on the wall and said, "Designation Beatwell, my brother, we were matched by the council." I asked what the council was. She said, "The elders, the ones who decide the pairings, who review the outcomes, who determine which children are kept and which are recycled." I did not ask what recycled meant. I did not want to know. The surveyors retreated immediately and rode for the nearest law enforcement, the sheriff's office in Gainesville, 26 miles away. They arrived after dark, exhausted and traumatized, and convinced the sheriff that an immediate response was required. Sheriff Thomas Brennan, a practical man not given to flights of imagination, assembled a posse of 8 deputies and rode for the Whitlock property, reaching it at dawn on August 7th. The confrontation that followed was documented in multiple sworn statements given at the subsequent legal proceedings. The Whitlock family was assembled when the sheriff's party arrived, standing in formation before their stone house. 27 individuals ranging from Cornelius, now ancient and bent but still alive, to infants carried in the arms of their mothers. Or at least, women who might have been their mothers, or their sisters, or their daughters. The genealogical confusion was immediately apparent to everyone present. The sheriff demanded entry to inspect the underground rooms. Cornelius, speaking as the family patriarch, refused, stating that what occurred on private property was not subject to external regulation. The sheriff presented a warrant, obtained on emergency authority based on the surveyor's testimony regarding the imprisoned woman. Cornelius's response was recorded verbatim in the court documents. "You come here with papers and guns, thinking you represent civilization and law. But law is a human construct, changeable and arbitrary. What we have done here transcends law. We have taken the principles of animal husbandry, proven over millennia to improve stock, and applied them to our own bloodline. You recoil in horror, but you eat the beef from carefully bred cattle. You ride horses whose lineages are tracked for generations. You benefit from dogs shaped by selective breeding. Why is it acceptable for animals but forbidden for humans? Because your weak morality cannot accept that humanity is subject to the same natural laws as all other life. We have eliminated weakness from our family. We have concentrated desirable traits. In 3 generations, we have created a bloodline that is healthier, more intelligent, more physically capable than any random coupling could produce. Yes, there have been failures. Yes, there have been necessary cullings. But the results justify the methods. Look at our children. Look at their symmetry, their vigor, their capabilities. They are proof that humanity can be improved through deliberate action." The sheriff was unmoved by the philosophical argument. His deputies forced entry into the house and descended into the underground complex. What they found in the hours that followed would fill 300 pages of testimony in the trial that came later. The preserved specimens numbered 97, each representing a child born to the Whitlock breeding program and terminated due to unacceptable deviations from the desired template. The medical records showed that of the 84 live births documented over 25 years, only 31 had been deemed suitable to keep. The others had been disposed of in ways the records described with bureaucratic detachment. The woman found in the cell was one of 7 females currently designated as breeding stock, selected for their genetic profiles, and kept in the underground facility between pregnancies. The rooms included a surgical suite where forced sterilizations were performed on individuals judged unsuitable for reproduction, a nursery where infants were assessed and categorized, and a library containing Cornelius's journals spanning 5 decades, documenting every aspect of his grand experiment in human improvement. The journals are now sealed in the Missouri State Archives, available only to researchers with specific clearance. Excerpts released to the court show the progression of Cornelius's thinking from theoretical curiosity to active experimentation, to absolute conviction that he was conducting sacred work. An entry from 1873 reads, "Martha passed today from fever. I grieve as a husband but recognize that her contribution to the great work is complete. She bore me 3 strong sons and accepted my vision without the weakness of moral objection that plagues lesser minds. The more girls have adapted well to their roles. Sarah has produced 2 viable offspring from unions with my eldest son. Elizabeth shows promise but has failed twice, producing children with defects requiring termination. Catherine is young yet and may prove most valuable. I have begun detailed measurements of all family members to establish baseline data for tracking improvements across generations." If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The Whitlock family was arrested in its entirety. The adults were charged with various crimes including murder, imprisonment, and violations of decency laws that were stretched to cover acts for which no specific statutes existed. The children presented a more complex problem. They ranged in age from infancy to 20 years, and their exact parentage was a genetic tangle that even Cornelius's meticulous records could not fully clarify. Many were the products of multiple generations of interbreeding, their family trees not branching but looping back on themselves in configurations that defied normal categorization. The question of what to do with these children occupied authorities for months. They were victims, certainly, but victims shaped by the only life they had known. The trial of Cornelius Whitlock and his surviving sons began in March of 1895 and lasted 6 weeks. The courtroom in Gainesville was packed daily with spectators drawn by morbid curiosity and genuine horror. Newspapers from as far as New York sent reporters. The testimony was graphic, disturbing, and for many observers, incomprehensible. How could educated people, people of means and intelligence, engage in such practices? The defense attorney, a man named Stuart Caldwell who took the case reluctantly and regretted it for the rest of his life, attempted to argue that the Whitlocks were engaged in scientific inquiry that, while ethically questionable, did not constitute criminal activity. He cited precedents in animal breeding and the emerging field of eugenics, which was gaining academic respectability in universities across America. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael Reeves, countered that no scientific purpose justified the imprisonment, forced breeding, and systematic killing documented in the Whitlock records. The testimony of the woman found in the underground cell was crucial to the prosecution's case, though her mental state made her a problematic witness. The woman, identified in court only as Subject F4 as she refused to use any other name, testified in a monotone voice that showed no emotion. "I was born in the family," she said. "I was raised understanding that my purpose was to contribute to the improvement of our bloodline. When I reached appropriate age, I was evaluated by the Council of Elders and matched with Beatwell for breeding purposes. We have produced 4 children together. 2 were kept. 2 were terminated due to defects. I am currently carrying what we hope will be a viable 5th. I do not understand why this is considered wrong. We are improving ourselves. We are eliminating weakness. This is rational. This is purposeful. Why is it acceptable for society to allow the weak to breed randomly, producing inferior offspring while punishing us for trying to elevate humanity?" Her testimony caused an uproar in the courtroom. Several spectators had to be removed. The judge called for order repeatedly. What disturbed people most was not anger or defiance in her words, but sincere confusion. She genuinely did not understand why the family's practices were considered crimes. She had been so thoroughly conditioned by the ideology she was born into that concepts of consent, bodily autonomy, and human dignity were literally incomprehensible to her. A doctor who examined the Whitlock children testified about the physical evidence of generational inbreeding. "I have identified numerous conditions consistent with reduced genetic diversity," he stated. "Several children show skeletal abnormalities, mild but measurable. Others have decreased immune function, making them susceptible to infections. I have observed a higher than normal incidence of hemophilia, color blindness, and developmental delays. Paradoxically, I have also observed some individuals with exceptional characteristics: superior height, unusual sensory acuity, remarkable memory. The Whitlock experiment has produced a population with exaggerated traits, both positive and negative, but at tremendous cost. For every child displaying beneficial characteristics, 2 or 3 showed serious defects requiring medical intervention or termination. The most damning evidence came from Cornelius's own journals, read aloud in court over several days. The old man sat through the readings with no apparent shame, occasionally nodding as if hearing his own words validated his work. An entry from 1886 described the decision to terminate a 6-year-old child who had developed seizures. Subject C9 has proven unsuitable for continuation. The seizure disorder appears genetic and may compromise the line if allowed to reproduce. Despite emotional attachments formed by other family members, rational analysis requires removal. The termination was performed by chloroform administration, followed by dissection to study the neurological basis of the condition. Tissues were preserved for future reference. The other children were present for the procedure as an educational demonstration of necessary decision-making. They showed appropriate detachment. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as this and similar entries were read. The casual description of killing a child, the presence of other children as witnesses, the framing of murder as education, it revealed a mindset so divorced from normal human empathy that people struggled to process it. Cornelius showed no remorse. When allowed to make a statement in his own defense, he spoke for 3 hours, laying out his philosophy, his methods, his results. "I stand before you accused of crimes," he said, "but I submit that the only crime committed is society's willful ignorance of biological reality. Humans are animals. Animals can be improved through selective breeding. This is not opinion but observable fact. I have simply applied established principles to my own family, creating across 3 generations a population that is measurably superior in numerous metrics. Yes, there have been failures. All experiments produce failures. Yes, there have been necessary eliminations. All breeding programs require culling, but the outcome justifies these costs. My descendants are stronger, more intelligent, more resistant to disease than their random-bred counterparts. In time, if this work were allowed to continue, we would produce a population that would be to common humanity what humanity is to apes. You stop this work not because it has failed, but because it has succeeded, and that success frightens you." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Cornelius and his 3 sons were found guilty on all counts. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out within 60 days. The women of the family, including the Moore sisters who had arrived as servants decades earlier, were found guilty of lesser charges, their involvement judged to be coerced or conditioned. They received prison sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. The children, all 21 of them, were declared wards of the state. The question of what to do with them remained unresolved. Cornelius Whitlock was hanged on June 14, 1895, at the age of 81. His last words, recorded by the attending minister, were not repentance but defiance. "The work will continue. You can kill me, but you cannot kill the idea. Others will see what I have proven and will take up the work. Humanity's future lies not in random breeding but in deliberate improvement. You call me a monster, but your grandchildren will call me a prophet." His sons were executed the same day, showing no more emotion than their father. The newspaper accounts describe all 4 men going to their deaths with the same calm certainty, as if they were participants in an experiment that would vindicate them eventually. The hangings drew a crowd of over 2,000, many traveling significant distances to witness the execution of men who had committed crimes that challenged fundamental assumptions about family, science, and human nature. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The Whitlock property was seized by the state and sold at auction to pay legal costs and provide restitution to victims. No one wanted it. The auction was held 3 times before a buyer was found, a speculator from St. Louis who planned to subdivide it for farming. He never followed through. The property sat abandoned, and stories began to circulate almost immediately. People reported hearing sounds from the underground rooms, despite them being sealed with concrete. Travelers claimed to see lights moving through the empty house at night. Children from nearby farms said they saw other children watching them from the Whitlock property line, children who looked too similar to each other, who moved in unison, who disappeared when approached. In 1897, a fire of unknown origin destroyed the main house. The underground complex remained, sealed but intact. Local authorities posted guards to prevent curiosity seekers from entering. The guards reported strange experiences. Objects moved in the sealed rooms, they claimed. Voices echoed up from below. One guard resigned after 3 nights, saying he heard children singing, the same song repeated endlessly, and when he investigated, he found fresh footprints in the dust of the sealed entrance, prints too small to be an adult's, too numerous to be explained. The property was eventually condemned and left to nature. Within a decade, the forest had reclaimed most of the surface structures. The underground rooms, too expensive to fill completely, were sealed with heavy iron grates and forgotten, or at least people tried to forget. The Whitlock children, the survivors of the breeding program, were distributed to various institutions and foster homes across Missouri and neighboring states. Tracking their fates is difficult because authorities deliberately obscured their origins, trying to give them fresh starts unburdened by their history. But fragments of records survive, and those fragments tell disturbing stories. Many of the children never adapted to normal society. They struggled with concepts of individual identity, having been raised in a collective where personal desires were subordinated to family purpose. Several were institutionalized for various behavioral and psychological conditions. A few appeared to integrate successfully, taking new names, building new lives, disappearing into the anonymity of early 20th century America. But there were troubling patterns. A 1920 study conducted by a psychologist named Dr. Helena Marsh, who had worked with several former Whitlock children, noted consistent characteristics. These individuals display remarkable intelligence in certain domains, particularly pattern recognition, mathematical reasoning, and memory. However, they show profound deficits in emotional processing and social bonding. They form attachments reluctantly and superficially. They view relationships transactionally, always calculating costs and benefits. Most disturbing, they show intense curiosity about genetic inheritance and family planning, often asking detailed questions about how traits are passed from parents to children, which genetic combinations produce optimal outcomes. It is as if the ideology they were raised in, despite being removed from it, continues to shape their worldview at a fundamental level. One former Whitlock child, known in records as Subject M7, kept a diary that was discovered after his death in 1932. The diary, now in the possession of the Missouri Historical Society, provides rare insight into the psychological legacy of the Whitlock experiment. An entry from 1924 reads, "I have been in the outside world for 29 years now. I have learned to mimic normal behavior, to express emotions I do not fully feel, to participate in social rituals I find meaningless. But I cannot escape what I am. I was created deliberately, my genes selected and combined with purpose. My parents were brother and sister, chosen for their complementary traits. I am not an accident of passion or random coupling. I am a designed object, and that knowledge shapes everything I perceive. When I see families with their randomly bred children, I feel contempt mixed with pity. They stumble through reproduction blindly, producing inferior offspring through genetic lottery. I understand intellectually that my upbringing was criminal, that what was done to create me was wrong. But emotionally, I cannot shake the conviction that Cornelius was right. Humanity could be improved through deliberate action. The methods were flawed, too crude, too brutal, but the principle was sound. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder what would have happened if the experiment had been allowed to continue. What would we have become in 10 generations, 20, 50? Would we have transcended humanity, or would we have collapsed into genetic dead ends? I will never know, but the question haunts me. In 1928, a reporter named Daniel Ackerman became obsessed with the Whitlock case. He spent 3 years tracking down former family members, reading sealed documents, interviewing anyone with connections to the original investigation. His research culminated in a book manuscript that was never published. The manuscript was rejected by 14 publishers, who found its content too disturbing for public consumption. One publisher's rejection letter stated bluntly, "The Whitlock case is a horror that America wishes to forget. Bringing it back into public consciousness serves no purpose except to remind people of humanity's capacity for rationalized evil. The market for such material does not exist." Ackerman's manuscript survives in a university archive, and it contains details not found in official records. He interviewed Subject F4, the woman found imprisoned in the underground cell after her release from prison in 1923. She had served 28 years despite her questionable culpability, released only when her health failed. Ackerman's notes from their conversation are chilling. She is 62 years old now, worn down by decades of incarceration, but her conviction remains unshaken. She still believes the Whitlock experiment was righteous. She still refers to herself by her subject designation. When I asked if she regretted her life, she looked at me with confusion. "Regret implies I had choices," she said. "I had a purpose. I fulfilled it. The outside world may call that slavery, but I call it meaning. Every person born in the family knew exactly why they existed, exactly what was expected of them. Can random-bred people say the same? They stumble through life making chaotic choices, producing accidental children, serving no greater design. We were part of something larger. That you cannot understand this does not make it wrong." Ackerman also tracked down several Whitlock descendants, children born to the survivors after they left the family compound. These second-generation individuals, raised normally but carrying Whitlock genes, showed troubling patterns. Higher than average rates of genetic disorders, yes, but also higher than average intelligence, physical capability, and a disturbing tendency toward rigid, systematized thinking. One man, grandson of a Whitlock survivor, became a prominent eugenicist in the 1930s, advocating for sterilization programs and racial purity laws. When his family history was discovered, he was forced to resign his academic position. But in a private letter found among his papers, he wrote, "They condemn me for my beliefs while ignoring that I am living proof of selective breeding's effectiveness. My grandparents were cousins, products of multiple generations of interbreeding. I should be a genetic disaster. Instead, I have an IQ of 160, perfect vision, no chronic health conditions, and physical attributes in the 99th percentile." The Whitlock methods were barbaric, but they worked. And if they worked crudely in an isolated compound with limited knowledge, what could be accomplished with modern genetics, proper medical supervision, and willing participants? The moral horror blinds people to the scientific validity, but the scientific validity remains, waiting for a generation brave enough to pursue it properly. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The Whitlock property remained abandoned for decades, a scar on the landscape that locals avoided. But in the 1960s, as America's interest in true crime and dark history grew, curiosity seekers began visiting the site. The underground complex, despite being sealed, proved accessible to determined explorers. Urban legend websites in the modern era contain dozens of accounts from people who claim to have explored the Whitlock tunnels. The stories are remarkably consistent, describing rooms that still contain the original jars, medical equipment, and charts on walls that detail genetic lineages going back 5 generations. Visitors report feeling watched, hearing breathing that has no source, and finding evidence that the rooms have been used recently, despite being sealed for over a century. One account from 2007 describes finding fresh flowers on what appeared to be a shrine, a collection of photographs showing all the Whitlock family members arranged in a genealogical display. The photographs, if genuine, should not exist. All Whitlock family photographs were supposedly destroyed after the trial, but the visitor who reported this included images uploaded to a paranormal investigation website. The photographs in those images show individuals who bear the characteristic Whitlock features, the sharp cheekbones, deep-set eyes, unusual symmetry. But they are dated to the 1980s and 90s, decades after the family's dispersal. The question that haunts researchers is whether the Whitlock bloodline truly ended with the dispersal of the children, or whether it continued in some form, carried forward by individuals who inherited not just genes but ideology. There is circumstantial evidence suggesting the latter. In 1986, a genetic counseling center in Springfield, Missouri, was shut down after investigators discovered it was offering services that bordered on eugenic selection. The center's director, a man named Dr. Raymond Shaw, had been helping couples screen embryos for desirable traits and eliminate those deemed inferior. When authorities examined his methodology, they found it eerily similar to the protocols described in Cornelius Whitlock's journals. Shaw's background investigation revealed that his great-grandmother had been subject E9, a Whitlock child placed in foster care in 1895. When confronted, Shaw admitted that his great-grandmother had told him stories about the family, about their mission to improve humanity, and that he had dedicated his career to continuing that work through legal means. The methods were wrong, he said during his deposition, but the goal was right. We can eliminate genetic diseases. We can enhance human capabilities. The Whitlocks tried to do it through inbreeding, which was doomed to fail. But with modern technology, genetic screening, embryo selection, we can achieve what they dreamed of without the barbarism. Why is this controversial? We select for traits in everything else we create. Why not in ourselves? The most disturbing evidence that the Whitlock ideology persists comes from online communities discovered in the early 2000s. Forums dedicated to voluntary eugenics, to improving the human species through conscious choice, attract thousands of participants. Some are fringe lunatics, but others are educated professionals, doctors, geneticists, academics. They discuss mate selection based on genetic compatibility, embryo screening for optimal traits, and the ethics of eliminating inferior genetic lines. In several of these forums, the Whitlock case is discussed not as a horror, but as a pioneering effort that failed due to limited knowledge and crude methods, but proved the principle. One post from 2009, written by a user claiming to be a genetic counselor, stated, "Cornelius Whitlock was ahead of his time. He understood that humanity cannot progress through random breeding. He lacked the tools we have now, the ability to sequence genomes to identify specific genes to make precise interventions. But his vision was correct. And as genetic technology advances, more people will reach his conclusions. We are on the edge of an era where parents will design their children, selecting for intelligence, health, beauty, talent. The Whitlock horror will be forgotten, but the Whitlock principle will be vindicated. In 3 generations, every child will be a designed child. And those who resist this future will find themselves evolutionary dead ends, producing inferior offspring who cannot compete. The question remains, are there still Whitlocks out there? Not people carrying the Whitlock name, which was deliberately erased, but people carrying Whitlock genes and Whitlock beliefs, scattered across America, perhaps reproducing, perhaps passing on not just DNA but ideology to children who will carry it forward. The genetic signature of concentrated inbreeding persists for generations. Tests conducted on known Whitlock descendants show markers consistent with their history, patterns visible in their chromosomes like scars. If such individuals were to seek each other out, if they were to connect through genetic testing services that have become ubiquitous in the 21st century, If they were to decide to continue the experiment their ancestors began, what would stop them? Modern law prohibits certain forms of genetic manipulation, but not mate selection. It prohibits discrimination but not personal choice in reproduction. The line between voluntary eugenics and criminal conspiracy is blurrier than most people realize. In 2019, a genetic genealogy researcher made a disturbing discovery. While analyzing genetic testing data from a major consumer genetics company, she found a cluster of individuals across 7 states who shared unusually high amounts of DNA, consistent with being products of 3 or 4 generations of close interbreeding. The pattern was familiar. It matched the genetic signature of known Whitlock descendants. But these individuals were young, born in the 1980s and 90s, suggesting that somewhere, somehow, the practice had continued. The researcher who spoke on condition of anonymity said, "What I found suggests there's a population, small but real, that is engaging in controlled interbreeding to preserve genetic concentration. They're not advertising it. They're not creating compounds. They're living normal lives in normal communities, but they're selecting mates from within a limited gene pool, likely coordinated through private networks. The genetic results are concerning. I see higher rates of recessive disorders but also clusters of unusual traits, enhanced memory, processing speed, sensory acuity. It's exactly what you'd expect from intensive selection pressure." I reported my findings to the genetic testing company and to health authorities. The company told me to delete the data for privacy reasons. The health authorities said without evidence of crime or immediate harm, they couldn't investigate. So this population, wherever they are, whatever they're doing, continues unchecked. The Whitlock legacy, it seems, did not end with hangings in 1895. It scattered, fragmented, went underground, and perhaps reconstituted itself in forms adapted to modern society. The compound in the Ozarks is gone, reclaimed by forest, the underground rooms sealed and slowly collapsing. But the idea, the terrible, logical, inhuman idea that drove Cornelius Whitlock and his family, that idea survives. It survives in academic papers that carefully avoid mentioning the Whitlock case, but advance similar arguments. It survives in online communities where people share strategies for genetic optimization of offspring. It survives in the legal gray areas of reproductive technology, where parents can select embryos based on dozens of traits, eliminating those deemed unsuitable. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In 2022, during the pandemic lockdowns, a historian researching the Whitlock case received an anonymous email. The email contained a photograph, dated and authenticated through metadata analysis to have been taken in 2020. The photograph shows 7 children, ranging in age from approximately 4 to 14, standing in formation before a stone structure that resembles the foundations of the original Whitlock house. The children's faces show the characteristic Whitlock features, the symmetry, the deep-set eyes, the sharp bone structure. They are dressed identically. They stand in perfect alignment, and behind them, visible in the background, is a figure whose face is obscured but whose posture suggests age and authority. The email included no message except a single line. The work continues, blood to blood, generation to generation, perfection through purpose. The historian contacted authorities who investigated the photograph's origin. The metadata indicated it was taken in the Ozark region of Missouri, but the exact location could not be determined. Image analysis suggested the photograph had not been digitally manipulated. The children appeared real. The setting appeared authentic. But no follow-up investigation produced results. No missing children matched the images. No complaints had been filed. If the photograph was genuine, it represented a family living off-grid, outside official documentation, continuing practices that should have ended over a century ago. The Whitlock case forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. What happens when rational thought, when scientific method, when intellectual rigor is applied without moral constraint? Cornelius Whitlock was not insane. His journals reveal a mind of remarkable clarity, capable of complex reasoning and long-term planning. He understood genetics before the field had a name. He recognized principles that would become mainstream biology decades after his death. His methods were barbaric, yes, but his logic was sound within its own framework. If you accept the premise that humans are animals, and animals can be improved through breeding, then the conclusions follow inevitably. The horror of the Whitlock case is not that it was the work of a madman, but that it was the work of a rational man who had convinced himself that reason justified anything, that logic overrode morality, that improvement of outcomes justified any cost. And that mindset, that willingness to treat humans as experimental subjects in pursuit of genetic optimization, that has not disappeared from the world. It has simply become more sophisticated, more hidden, more adapted to contemporary sensibilities. The underground rooms where the Whitlocks conducted their experiment may be sealed, but the intellectual space where such experiments are rationalized remains wide open, populated by people who believe that humanity's future lies not in accepting our diversity, but in eliminating our flaws, not in embracing the randomness of nature, but in imposing deliberate design. The final question, the one that keeps researchers awake, the one that has no comfortable answer. How many more Whitlock families exist right now today, operating within legal bounds or just beyond them, pursuing the same goal through methods refined by a century of technological advancement? How many children are being born into families where mate selection is based on genetic optimization, where reproduction is treated as a project rather than a choice, where the ideology of improvement through controlled breeding persists despite its horrific history? The genetic testing revolution has made it easier than ever for people with similar beliefs to find each other, to coordinate, to form communities bound not by geography, but by shared genetic heritage and shared ideology. The legal framework has not caught up. You cannot prosecute someone for choosing to reproduce with a genetically similar partner. You cannot regulate private mate selection. You cannot ban people from having children based on their beliefs about genetic improvement, no matter how disturbing those beliefs might be. The Whitlock experiment was stopped by its visibility, by the dramatic collapse that exposed it to authorities. But what about experiments that remain hidden, that never collapse, that continue generation after generation in plain sight, protected by privacy laws and reproductive rights? The stone foundations in the Ozark Valley are still there, overgrown but not gone. The underground rooms are still there, sealed but not destroyed. And somewhere, perhaps scattered across the country or perhaps gathered in new compounds that have learned the lessons of the past and hidden themselves more effectively, the descendants of the Whitlock experiment may still exist. They would be 7, 8, 9 generations removed from Cornelius now. They would carry his genes, concentrated and refined, or perhaps degraded beyond viability. They would carry his beliefs, adapted and evolved, or perhaps abandoned in favor of normal lives. We don't know. We cannot know. And that uncertainty is perhaps the most disturbing legacy of all. The Whitlock case teaches us that the line between science and horror, between improvement and atrocity, between rational optimization and inhuman cruelty, that line is not as clear as we would like to believe. It teaches us that educated people, people of means and intelligence, can convince themselves that the most terrible actions are justified if the goal is sufficiently elevated. And it teaches us that ideas, especially ideas that appeal to our desire to control and improve and perfect, those ideas do not die when their originators die. They persist. They evolve. They wait for new hosts, new advocates, new generations willing to pursue them despite the lessons of history. The Whitlocks are gone, but the question they embodied remains. In an age of advancing genetic technology, in an era where we can select and modify and optimize, what stops us from becoming what they tried to be? What prevents the next Cornelius Whitlock from emerging, not in an isolated compound but in a respected laboratory, not using crude breeding programs but using CRISPR and embryo selection and artificial wombs? The answer should be ethics, morality, law. But history suggests that for some people, those constraints are not barriers but challenges to overcome, problems to solve, obstacles in the path toward what they see as inevitable progress. And somewhere in America tonight, in a place we cannot see, someone may be looking at genetic charts, planning pairings, calculating outcomes, and dreaming of perfection, just as Cornelius Whitlock did in 1870, convinced that they are doing sacred work, that history will vindicate them, that the horror is justified by the goal. The Whitlock family case still haunts America not because it happened, but because it may still be happening, transformed and hidden, but pursuing the same terrible logic toward the same unknowable end.